Welcome to the Nebraska Soybean Board Weekly Market Roundup, being brought to you by Nebraska soybean farmers and their checkoff. I'm Susan Littlefield. I tell you, if there was any more excitement, it was all about the WASDE report that came out midday, how the markets reacted, and the global numbers as well, as we hone in on what's happening state by state. Maybe some surprises out there. And it should come as no surprise, weather has also been a big part of that factor. We're going to take a look at that report coming up today.
It may be small, but this little bean fuels a lot of power. It powers a food industry as a top source of protein. It's a fuel that powers diesel engines with fewer emissions. It powers a state economy and bottom lines. And it powers the rest of the world as a top Nebraska export. Yeah, it may be small, but we're finding more ways for this little bean to power Nebraska.
Welcome back once again. Joining me is going to be Brian Splitt. Brian is with agmarket.net, and we've got Darin Fessler with Lakefront Futures. And gentlemen, an exciting WASDE report in the sense that a lot of information come out. And Brian, I'm going to start with you. Kind of give me your thoughts on what you saw in those numbers.
I think the biggest surprise to me personally was seeing the USDA raise the soybean yield. I think the trade was pretty much in agreement that the yield would come down, maybe not a ton, but at least in that direction. So seeing the USDA take the soybean yield on a national average up to 51.9 bushels per acre, matching the previous record, was a surprise. And so the algos saw that number. They saw they sold it immediately. That was a knee-jerk reaction. But I think anybody that was paying attention thought that might have been a buying opportunity, and that as we progress through the next couple of reports, that we would likely see the yield come back down from that level. Now, I think the other thing that made the corn report maybe a little bit more bullish than what the domestic numbers might have suggested, because we came in at about 14 million bushels less than what the trade estimate was. You had the world stocks down significantly. So with the crop in the EU deteriorating, I think that was really what made that report bullish for corn.
All right, Darin, for you, did you see any surprises and things that caught your eye in this report numbers?
I have to agree with Brian here. I think the big head scratcher was the increase in the bean yields, and I'm just looking at what they thought across the country, state by state, where these record-like beans are going to come from, and I'm looking at western Iowa into eastern parts of Nebraska that, boy, they are going backwards in a big way. And stuff that I've physically walked, I've seen it, and I think it's a big enough area that it's going to move that needle nationally, not just for beans, but also for corn. I'm looking at this from an opportunity where these balance sheets are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And I think, again, it was like Brian had mentioned, it's the algos had seen that number, sold it off nearly 40 cents only to buy it back. Corn had a really nice turnaround as well, bouncing off the 32%, 38% Fibonacci extension level. And again, I think that this is a trade that probably understands that in the future reports that were coming here, we're probably going to see some lower yield numbers come from the USDA.
So obviously, state by state, you brought up Nebraska and Iowa. Was there any state specific besides maybe those two that caught your attention?
I think that we got to continue to watch North Dakota, given how late it's been planted. There's a lot of things that may look good in North Dakota, but it's just awfully late in there, and given their seasonalities of weather, an early frost is not out of the question for them.
Brian, what about for you? You're in the Eastern Corn Belt, where it seems like they got some rain, and at least from the social media points I'm seeing, things are looking good. So were you happy with the numbers that came out of the Eastern Corn Belt?
Well, so I would maybe look specifically at Iowa and Illinois. And when you think back to last year, it was very dry early in the growing season, especially for the western parts of Iowa, but it finished really well. And so it was kind of the opposite of that this year, where they had a pretty decent start, but now it's just deteriorating as we get towards the back end of the growing season. And I could see the Iowa state yields going backwards, but I think the Illinois yields are maybe a little bit light. I could see a record yield in Illinois based on the producers that we're talking to. And one of our business partners, Matt Bennett, he farms in Illinois, and he's pretty excited about his yield potential. So I think you're going to see Iowa go a little bit backwards here over the next month or two on the USDA reports. But I think Illinois, especially if we can get some more rain and finish really well, I think that yield potential is going to go up. Producers in Indiana, Ohio, by and large, they're very happy with their crop. And it's kind of the same thing. They were extremely dry early in the growing season, but they've gotten some timely rains, and it's really improved the crop there.
So I'm curious, as you have conversations, both of you, with your clientele, Brian, was anybody saying, hey, wait a second, I agree or I don't disagree with these numbers?
I think we've tried to make it a habit to not necessarily agree or disagree with the USDA. It's one of those things where, if you try to fight the USDA in the big picture, sometimes it's a losing battle. But I think some of those things where you see it and you know right away that it's not right, or that number is going to be changing in the future. And I would just point directly towards that soybean yield number. I do think that the corn yield may walk itself backwards a little bit over time. But like I said, I think if you're going to see some reduction in Iowa corn yields, you're going to see an increase in some of the Eastern Corn Belt yields, and it may offset each other. So I think the soybean balance sheet's really going to be the one to watch here moving forward.
What about for you, Darin? Did you have some clients that said, hey, wait a second, I'm looking at my field and I question it?
Well, even ahead of today's report, Brian, and the Eastern Corn Belt, from Ohio that got planted really, much later than normal, that crop out there is looking phenomenal. And then over to Indiana and into Illinois, that these areas that keep getting these rains, again, they are finishing strong, and it's going to be a big difference, I think, between the Eastern Corn Belt and the West at the end of the day if the West does not catch some of these rains. And I do think some of the gains that we're going to be seeing in the Eastern Corn Belt are going to offset some of the losses in Nebraska. But the thing about Western Iowa and Nebraska is, in particular Nebraska, is, and I think that you'll see some of this in some crop tours ahead here, that there is some stuff that is very, very late planted that's not even tasseled yet, and we're already talking, the middle of August. So now the question is, do we have Mother Nature that progresses long enough to really get it to the finish line? Because an early freeze at this point over some of the highest production areas in Nebraska, it's going to sway that needle. And so Nebraska coming in at 180 national corn yield, or 180 on the yield, I'm really scratching my head on that number. And I think that there is a good 10 bushel that could be decreased from Nebraska if this thing doesn't finish well. And I think at the end of the day, that could do a bushel or two off that national yield. So I think how the next couple of weeks finish out for weather-wise is going to be a big determining factor, because I am concerned given this heat that's going to come down a little bit. But if we don't get rain, these test weights are going to be in question, I think.
All right, as we continue here with the Nebraska Soybean Board Weekly Market Roundup, let's look at a world perspective for both of you. Darin, looking at those numbers, what caught your eye?
Well, in general, I think that if we look longer term out, next 6 months, 9 months, I think the biggest question about what I'm looking at here is, what's that relationship with China and Brazil, given that Brazil's coming off a pretty decent corn crop? Does the China-Taiwan situation escalate enough where, does it shun U.S. exports for more Brazilian exports? And the Fed, if they continue raising rates, which I think they're going to, how does that impact the dollar versus the real? So I'm looking at it from a perspective, I think the U.S. corn market between, say, November, December, and February, March, the exports could be at a challenge versus Brazilian corn exports. And then at the end of the day, if Brazil plants all these beans that the market says it's going to plant, how do they shape up by, say, that December to February timeframe? Does that put a little bit of a wrench into things for U.S. bean exports?
All right, Brian, for you, what are your thoughts on the world numbers?
Yeah, we touched briefly on the European crop. I think that that corn crop may still walk backwards a little bit. So we could see the world stocks numbers tighten up a little bit more for the corn market. But on soybeans, when you look at where we are right now, estimates of a little over 100 million tons of stocks for the world. That's up about 10 million tons from the old crop stocks. And a lot of that is really depending on this increase in the Brazilian soybean exports. And so it's really going to come down to whether or not this La Nina moderates. And if it does, and we have a very good crop, I think you've got, as Darin had mentioned, you've got concerns about China relations with the U.S. And it's not just going to be on the corn crop and corn exports. I'm frankly more concerned about soybean exports. And as we get into the new calendar year, into 2023, if we have the Brazilian crop in that 150 million ton area, somewhere up there, if that comes to fruition, it's going to be very difficult to be bullish U.S. soybean exports as we get into 2023.
So, what about Ukraine and the fact that they had ships that were being denied when they came to their final destination ports because the grain quality was so poor?
Yeah, so that was one of the things where Lebanon had said, well, we're not going to take this shipment because it was 5.5 months too late. And I think that raised some speculation as to whether that was the real reason or whether it was the quality of the grain. Ukraine's still going to be an issue moving forward. And we've talked about that over the last couple of weeks and months, Susan, as far as the ability for the Ukrainian producer to get their wheat crop sold to the exporter and have the cash flow necessary to plant this upcoming wheat crop. I think, and that's something we really didn't touch on our domestic numbers. And sometimes wheat slips under the radar, but our wheat stocks were about 40 million bushels less than what the trade was looking for. And I think that was kind of a sleeper bullish number on the report. And I think that lends a little bit more bullishness to the corn balance sheet as well. But again, as we move forward and we think about Ukraine and their ability to get all this crop planted for their new crop wheat, I think wheat's trying to make a good bottom. I think we've got a double bottom on D Chicago wheat down in that 770 area. And I wouldn't be surprised if this wheat market wants to go up and recover some of these losses that we've seen over the last couple months in order to make sure that we get our own domestic plantings up to required levels.
All right. Well, it's going to be interesting times as we move into the numbers come Sunday night. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us this weekend.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
I always want to remind folks, commodity futures and options do involve a substantial risk of loss that aren't suitable to all investors. That's been this week's version of the Nebraska Soybean Board Weekly Market Roundup here on the Rural Radio Network.